So let's go ahead. You recall where we are right now is in the story, the unfolding trials. Jesus actually has 5 trials as Luke tells the story. If you put all the pieces together, there's actually maybe one more, but Luke spells it out as 5 trials. And one of the things we notice as we're going along, that in a sense, what we have here are the trials of Jesus, but in a much deeper sense, what we have here is a trial by Jesus of all of those before whom he stands, because he is, after all, the judge. He is the Son of Man. He is the Messiah. And although it looks as if Christ is the one who's having to defend himself, he's the defendant, as a matter of fact, in the greater scheme of things, he's the one who's evaluating those who come before him. And we see that in the subtleties of the way that Luke tells the story. There's 5 of these. The first 2 are Jesus appearing before Jewish authority. First of all, Jewish religious authority. Secondly, Jewish civil authority. We have the high priest on the one hand and the Sanhedrin on the other. And then the last trials are before Gentile authority. So he appears before Pilate. Pilate shuffles him over to Herod. Herod shuffles him back. And the last trial, Luke sort of intimates that the final one is really before all the people. The people have been his great support. The high priests were always fearful of taking Jesus in public because of the people. But as it turns out, even the people turn against him, as Luke spells it out for us. So that in the final analysis, Jesus winds up alone. And the subtlety of the way Luke tells the story is that even though Jesus is alone, he then, in that lonely place, acts as our substitute. And the story of Barabbas that we get to today is that wonderful, intriguing substitute, where Jesus gets what Barabbas and all the rest of us deserve, and Barabbas, standing for the rest of us, goes free. So as we look at the story, we see Luke kind of giving us those themes as he spells it out. So anyway, we are at the end of chapter 22, right at verse 63, and we'll pick up there and then just keep rolling along as we have time. So Luke 22, verse 63, the Word of God. And the men who were holding him mocked him and struck him and blindfolded him and then asked him, "Prophesy to us. Who is it that struck you?" And with many other blasphemies they spoke to him. And as the day was dawning, the elders of the people and the high priests and the scribes gathered together. And they led him before the Sanhedrin, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." He said to them, "If I were to tell you, you wouldn't believe. If I ask you anything, you won't answer. But from this point on, it will be that the Son of Man will be sitting at the right hand of the power of God." They said to him, "So you are the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? We ourselves have heard him out of his own mouth." So that's the second trial. First one last week, you recall, before the high priest, and then the second one now before the Sanhedrin. So let's have a word of prayer and we'll take a look at this. Father, we're grateful for this opportunity that you've given us again to gather around your word. And we pray that your Spirit would be present with us, that you would help us in our conversation as we try to hear this text, to hear it in the way you intended, and that which you want us to learn would be embedded into our minds and hearts as a result of the fact that we're here this morning. We give you thanks for it now in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, this short little kind of sandwich paragraph, first of all. The men who held him mocked him and struck him and blindfolded him and then said, "Prophesy to us, tell us who struck you," and with many other blasphemies they spoke to him. And I think what Luke wants us to simply catch here, and we see it repeated, is this strange sort of joking humor that accompanies this most serious event. This is one of the strange aspects of the trial of Jesus, is there's so much joking, there's so much humor, there's so much mockery. You know, it's been said that you can tell a lot about a person by looking at what they laugh at. And in this case, the indictment is against people who laugh at things that are reverent, things that are worthy of respect, become objects of mockery. And we see that, in a sense, highlighted here. I'm being attacked just a second by something in my eye. I guess I got it. And so we see that all the way through. Certainly when he's before Herod, we're going to find this same kind of joking atmosphere. And even when Jesus is hanging on the cross, here are the soldiers having a dice game right at the feet of the greatest cosmic event in history, blind to it, making fun of it. And so I think Luke gives us that just to be a little bit of a reminder of how blind we are in the face of these great events. All right, and then verse 66. When the day was dawning, the elders of the people and the high priests and the scribes gathered together and led him before the Sanhedrin. Luke tells us the day is dawning. This is the day we call Good Friday. It's one of a variety of days we celebrate in our church calendar, days that are especially remembered and observed. We have Christmas, we have Good Friday, we have Easter. What comes next? Ascension Sunday. And do you know what? It is today. And it is interesting that we do tend to skip over that, don't we? We tend to miss that. I heard it argued once that should probably be the pinnacle celebration. This is the point where Jesus says to his disciples, I won. All authority is given unto me. He commissions them and he ascends. That's the meaning of the word, ascends to his throne. This is his coronation. This is when Jesus is crowned King of Kings, Lord of Lords, takes his position, as he says right here, at the right hand of God Almighty to reign over the cosmos, and he will reign until he comes back to judge the quick and the dead. He will reign until he's put every enemy under his feet, Paul tells us. And we're in the midst of that reign because we are in his kingdom as he exercises his rule. And it all started today, Ascension Sunday, you see. So I think we should have a whole new calendar, a whole new holiday in our church. Not that it isn't one, and some parts of the church do celebrate it, as you know, rather extravagantly, but we tend in our Protestant tradition to skip over it.
We have a few floats just across the street.
Thank you. Excellent. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Unwitting celebrants of the day. Yeah, that's right.
I think there are a few striking bands.
So, that's right. So, this is the day that's dawning, Good Friday in this case, and we have the gathering then of this ruling body. Israel was a parliamentary form of government, and the highest body, you might say the parliament of Israel, was called the Sanhedrin. That body had been created many, many hundreds of years earlier, but it acquired that name, Sanhedrin, about 100 years before the events that are taking place now. That's a Greek word, Sanhedrin, and it has to do with a kind of ruling body or a council. The beginnings of the Sanhedrin, which was otherwise called the Council of Elders, probably goes back to Numbers chapter 11. And if you know that story, you know that that's the point where God took the Spirit that rested upon Moses and distributed it to 70 elders of the people. And from that point on, it seems that Israel was governed by this ruling body. They might have a king, they might have other kinds of governmental authorities, but this was always the body that carried, you might say, the great weight in Israel's culture, and it continues down to the present, down to this day, that is. And so we have the Sanhedrin. It was made up of various representatives and we find them ticked off here. The elders of the people, these were mostly Pharisees. These were people who were chosen because of their conspicuous wisdom or maturity or experience. They were usually older people, of course, and they represented one faction, as it were, of the Sanhedrin. Then you have these priests. These were largely Sadducees. They were usually in the majority. And so the political power in the Sanhedrin tended to tilt toward the Sadducees, the more liberal, naturalistic people who were very comfortable with the relationship with Rome. So you have that kind of division of the house. The minority report, the majority report. Pharisees, Sadducees, and a lot of hostility between them. You may recall that when Paul himself was before the Sanhedrin, he takes the opportunity to play on that hostility and declares himself a Pharisee. And immediately, a riot almost breaks out in the place because he had sort of hit the powder keg there with that statement. So that was the tension. And then the people who more or less floated between the two teams, more or less functioning, you might say, like referees, were known as the scribes. These were the lawyers. If you can imagine this as a football game, you've got the Seahawks. That's the Pharisees. They tend to lose. You have the, Chicago or somebody, the Sadducees. And then you have the referees in the striped shirts. And they were the lawyers. They were the people who were making sure everybody played by the rules. And they could go either way. They tended to be sympathetic toward the Pharisees, but they also knew that they had to keep a kind of detached balance. So this was the configuration of the Sanhedrin. And this is the body then before whom Jesus is brought. And they ask him the question, if you are the Christ, tell us. The interesting thing about this paragraph is we find all four of the major titles connected with Christ, with Jesus, are found in this paragraph. And I think this is intentional on Luke's part. The first title that we run into is the one now raised by the questioner themselves. If you are the Christ. Christ, of course, the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah, was the anointed one, the one who was anticipated through the Old Testament, who would come as a ruler and who would launch what was known as the Messianic age. And so Israel had anticipated down through the centuries that someday one would come who would be the Messiah, the Christ. And obviously a lot of people came claiming that, and that reputation had certainly attached itself to Jesus, and Jesus had not disputed it. Peter said, you are the Christ, at the Caesarea Philippi confession. Jesus didn't want to start a popular uprising, so he kind of kept that under wraps to some degree, but nevertheless, that was indeed the case. But Jesus' response here is a little more oblique. He says, if I were to tell you, you wouldn't believe it. And furthermore, if I ask you any questions, you wouldn't answer. It seems a strange response, but again, it's Luke telling us that Jesus is actually the one who is the judge here. Jesus is the one. And he's pointing out the problem with this entire proceeding, namely that it's a violation of due process from start to finish. The ancient Israelites had a very sophisticated idea of due process. They understood notions of confronting your accusers, of having a fair and impartial kind of adjudication, and so on. They were probably about as enlightened as any ancient civilization ever was with respect to what we call basic fairness in the judicatory process. Jesus is pointing out to them, you haven't asked this question with any kind of sincere desire to hear my testimony. Shimmering beneath the surface of his answer is, of course, his admission that it's true. Are you the Christ? He doesn't deny it. He simply says, if I did tell you, you wouldn't believe it. Furthermore, if I ask you any questions, which is my right as an accused, to confront my accusers, to ask questions, you wouldn't answer me. This whole thing's a kangaroo court, in other words, is the kind of implied message of this, And so he doesn't dignify it by, playing the game because it's so illegitimate start to finish. Nevertheless, he then continues by making this statement, he says, then verse 69, "But from now on it will be the Son of Man," the grammar's a little awkward, but this is the basic idea. "From now on it'll be the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power of God." And there we have the second title, which Jesus himself introduces, Son of Man. It's Jesus' favorite term for himself. The term occurs 83 times in the New Testament, 81 of them from the lips of Jesus. So it's by far Jesus' favorite way to refer to himself. It virtually never occurs in the rest of the New Testament. The only other time it occurs not spoken by Jesus was the case of, somebody know off the top of your head? Stephen. And Stephen, when he is being stoned, after his sermon before the Sanhedrin, says, he looks up and he sees, "Behold, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of the throne of God." The Son of Man is this it's both a title of referring to humanity generally. What is man, that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man, that you take thought of him. But it also, of course, had this separate meaning connected originally in Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man ascends, comes to the Ancient of Days. And that was a view that had taken on a lot of horsepower and was well known, and Jesus seems to allow himself to be regarded as that person. So he declares it here, and so we have that second title then. They respond now and say, "Oh, so you are the Son of God," you see. Third title. The Son of God, the idea of being the Son of God is not unique to Jesus. I think you know that. Others are given that name in the Scriptures. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, "Everyone who is led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God." That term is used. Israel is sometimes called the Son of God. People who've looked at this closely believe that the fundamental and essential meaning of it is those who are obedient to God. To be God's son emphasizes being submissive to his direction or to his will. We know how much Jesus spoke about his concern to do the will of his Father. And in a sense there he's highlighting the fact that he is God's son. He is God's unique son in the sense that he uniquely, perfectly keeps God's will. He's the only begotten Son of God. The only one who with perfect, impeccable, consistency keeps God's rule and law in his life. And so that becomes a title of honor as well. So those three. So you are the Son of God. And then Jesus responds with this, which seems the most subtle and is in fact the most dramatic. Jesus responds and said to them, "You say that I am." Ego eimi is the Greek there. And it's the way in the New Testament that the name for God, Yahweh, is given in the Old Testament. The most dramatic example of that is in John chapter 8, you recall, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And they didn't misunderstand that. They picked up stones to stone him because he had made himself equal with God. That's the way they construed that. That's the meaning of that. I am is basically a reproduction of the old phrase Yahweh, which of course is I am, the name, you might say, for God in the Old Testament most commonly. The Jewish people, however, avoided saying that word because of its holiness, and so they substituted the word Lord, a kind of a construction of the Hebrew word Adonai, and so that's why in your Old Testament, whenever Yahweh is mentioned, it's actually the Lord in small caps, like I've tried to do it there. That's the other major title for Christ. He is the Lord. You see, I am. So those are the four great titles. There are others, but these would be the major titles that are attached to Jesus of Nazareth. And Luke makes sure we catch every one of them. And so then they say, what further need of witnesses do we have? We ourselves have heard it from his own mouth. Isn't that interesting? Usually people are tried for crimes of doing things. Lawyers in the room know that you don't try somebody for having something in their mind. You don't put somebody under a criminal indictment because they imagined doing a bad thing. Motive may be part of it, but motive must be mixed with action. We care about motive only after the action has occurred. What was your motive here? And that may criminalize an action. But without some action, it's hard to find a crime. Jesus is rather unique, I would say, in terms of the history of jurisprudence, in that here's a man who's being tried not for the crime of what he did, but for the crime of who he was. And so the criminal indictment here that they're going to bring to Pilate has simply to do with the titles that have been attached to him, and not with any action that he actually committed that they can identify. All right, so on we go to the next trial, and this one then is before Pilate. Chapter 23, starting at verse 1. And the entire crowd rose up and led him to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting the nation, prohibiting paying taxes to Caesar, and making himself out as the Christ, a king." Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "Those are your words." Pilate said to the high priests and the crowds, "I find nothing blameworthy in this man." And they ratcheted up, yelling, "He has been an earthquake with his teaching in Judea, starting out there in Galilee, and now he's right here at our doorstep." All right. So the whole crowd rose up and led him to Pilate. So this is an important transition. Up until now, Jesus has been only evaluated by the Jewish authority. Religious authority, civil authority. Church, state. They've both looked at Jesus, and they have both now reached the conclusion he's got to go. So now they cross the line from Jewish authority to Gentile authority, and they take him to Pilate. And of course, Pilate stands for the Gentile world. In a sense, he stands for us. He stands for the rest of the human race there. And so they bring him to Pilate. Pilate was, as you know, the term that was applied to him was the proconsul. Literally, that means the one that served for the consul. The rulers in Rome traditionally have been consuls. And so a proconsul was one that served at that person's appointment. We typically call them something like a governor. Pilate had been there since the year 26, about 4 years earlier. He would serve until the year 36, and then he was fired. He was appointed by a guy named Sejanus, who served under Tiberius Caesar. Sejanus himself was eventually convicted of and executed for conspiracy to overthrow the Caesar. And that put everybody that Sejanus had appointed at some risk, and Pilate seems to have been caught in the crossfire of that. We don't have it that he was fired just because he was acting poorly, but it seems that it was political. From there he passes from the scene. Tradition says he committed suicide some years later. There's mixed, credibility to that report, but anyway, he does show up. Seems to have been an equestrian, meaning he was kind of from the middle class in Rome, but had kind of worked his way up the ranks, and so here we have him now for these 10 years in Jerusalem. He was not loved by the Jewish people. He was brutal. He would shed blood if he needed to keep a tight fist on these unruly people, and so Pilate was not particularly popular, but here we have him. So they take him to Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We have found this man perverting the nation, refusing to pay or prohibiting paying taxes to Caesar, and calling himself the Christ." And then, as if to explain it to Pilate, meaning a king, 3 charges. Oddly enough, each one of them is facially false and at the same time has an element of truth in it, Each of the charges was arguable, even though the way intended by these accusers, it wouldn't be true, at least on its face. The first of them, he's a perverter of the nation. This was the same thing, by the way, that Socrates was accused of. You may recall, when he was becoming unpopular in Athens, they accused him of being a perverter of the nation, especially of the youth, filling these youth with all kinds of, strange ideas. The judgment of history with respect to Socrates was he was the one sane guy trying to straighten out a perverse nation. But the fat cats who had a vested interest in the perversity of the nation called Socrates the perverter. You know how that works? Jesus is a little bit light in that same mold. The people who accused him of being perverters of the nation are the people who have been riding on a gravy train of benefits from the very perversity that Jesus himself is critiquing. And so they're calling him in what Freud might call an act of projection. They're projecting on him their own wickedness here. They're calling him the perverter of the nation, when in fact Jesus was the one trying to straighten them out. But from their point of view, that meant to undo their status. And so in that sense, the accusation was fair enough in terms of their own status in the society. The second one, he refuses to pay taxes to Caesar. Well, we know that Jesus himself had specifically authorized paying taxes to Caesar. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But Jesus draws a line there. And unto God the things that are God's. Rome wouldn't acknowledge that. Rome wanted your conscience. Rome wanted your worship. Rome wanted your unquestioned allegiance. And so Jesus does, in a subtle sense, prohibit paying taxes to Caesar if your taxes reach your conscience. Pay Caesar that which is his. Pay your taxes, absolutely. But as soon as he intrudes into that sacred place that belongs only to God, don't pay those taxes, And so even there's a little element of truth, and yet at the same time it's certainly misleading. The final accusation is that he makes himself out to be the Christ, that is a king. Now the way the accusers intended this to be taken by Pilate is he's a rabble-rouser. He's an insurrectionist. He's a guy who's trying to overthrow the government. He makes himself out to be a competitor to the authority of Rome. That's the way they were trying to communicate the idea. And certainly in that sense it was false. But Jesus absolutely presented himself as a king. He presented himself as Christ. He was those things, and so there was certainly truth to it as well. So every one of these accusations, interestingly, I think Luke wants us to hear, these are the enemies of Christ, understanding in some way who he is, but trying to twist it, so it becomes the grounds for this accusation. Pilate picks up on the last of these. He's especially interested in the part about wanting to be a king. So he goes. This is kind of a deal where the people were outside. The Praetorium was part of the Anatolia fortress, and so Pilate's sort of shuffling back and forth from a courtroom inside to the courtyard outside. And at one point they're actually yelling at each other across some distance. We'll see that a little later. So Pilate apparently goes now inside and asks Jesus the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" That's the one accusation Pilate's actually interested in. And Jesus answers, the Greek here is simply, "you say." And it is a Semitism, which is an oblique way of confirming the truth of it without quite saying it. I rendered it, "those are your words." Again, you hear the fact that Jesus, in a sense, is the judge. He's not here giving testimony. He's here taking testimony. So those are your words, And you can see this interesting drama as it plays out. Pilate, I don't know what happened. Other gospel writers give us more detail as to what goes on. John gives us quite a bit of information. Luke is fairly truncated in his report. But for whatever reasons, Pilate comes to believe that something is smelly in Denmark, that this is not what it purports to be. One of the other gospel writers tells us that Pilate knew it was out of envy that Jesus had been handed over, that he knew somehow this was really, on the part of these religious leaders, a fear of being sabotaged in their credibility before the people, that that's what was motivating them, and all of these charges were just pretense. Pilate was a smart guy, and he probably saw through that quickly enough. So having asked the question, he goes back to them and says, I find nothing. I want you to note that little word nothing. It occurs, and I don't know how it's translated in your text, but it's the Greek word uden. It means nothing. And it's repeated by Luke here about 6 times over the rest as the story unfolds. Nothing, 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 nothing. And after a while you begin to get the feeling this is not an accident. Luke wants us to feel the force of the fact that there was nothing in Jesus that warranted what was happening to him. Everything was on us. And that sets us up for the substitution that happens in the end. There's nothing in him that justifies this treatment, but he will take everything on himself that we deserved. And so the nothing here seems to be driving home that point. And Pilate's the first one to use the word. I find nothing in him blameworthy. The best way to render this is then they threw a temper tantrum. It's just they just went ballistic. They ratcheted up, yelling, he has been an earthquake. That's the word. Anasai is we get the word seismic from that, and that's what he's been upsetting the entire region, starting in Galilee, and he's brought it right here. The leaders are hoping that the mention of Galilee is going to trigger in Pilate a kind of negative reaction, because Galilee was a hotbed of insurrection. If someone was from Galilee, that made them immediately suspect, Earlier, Pilate himself had mixed the blood of some Galileans with their sacrifices. We heard about that in Luke 13. Pilate didn't like Galileans. They were not under his jurisdiction. They were under Herod's jurisdiction. But anytime he heard about them, he got upset. So they thought, this is how we'll get Jesus. We'll call him a Galilean. So they used the word for that purpose. It had an unintended consequence. Pilate seized on that as a good excuse to get Jesus off the radar here. Let's send him to Herod because he's from that jurisdiction. And that gives us this next paragraph. Pilate, having heard this, asked if the man was Galilean. And when he learned that he was, from the authority of Herod, this is Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, when he learned that he was from the jurisdiction of Herod, he sent him to Herod because he was in Jerusalem during those days. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very happy, because for a long time he had wanted to see him, having heard many things about him, and he was hoping that he would do some sign for him. He began to pepper him with questions using many words, but he himself said nothing, nothing, in response to him. Then the high priest stepped forward and the scribes and accused him. And Herod and his soldiers literally nothinged him and mocked him and dressed him in a sensational robe and sent him back to Pilate. From that day, Herod and Pilate became fast friends, though up until then they'd lived in tension. So there's our trial before Herod Antipas. Pilate, having heard that he was Galilean, or having heard this, asked if he was Galilean, because in fact that would give Pilate an out. He could get this troubling problem of Jesus out of his hair. He could get him off to someone else to deal with, and so as soon as he learned that he was from the authority of the jurisdiction of Herod, he sent him to Herod, because Herod was in Jerusalem during those days, of course, for the Passover. So it wasn't that far away. It's probably like 2 blocks away. It was a short little jaunt. Herod was very happy to see Jesus. He'd heard many things about him. He'd wanted to see him for a long time. He was hoping that he would perform some sign for him. Herod is... I'm trying to think of something I can say in polite society here. He was just worthless. Probably one of the most biting criticisms Jesus ever, how shall I put it? One of the most colorful examples of Jesus calling someone a name is the name that he associated with Herod. You may recall this, we covered it in Luke sometimes back. Some Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "You better leave town because Herod wants to kill you," referring to this Herod Antipas. And Jesus responds and says, "Go tell that fox, I'm going to do what I want, I will work today and tomorrow, and on the third day so he sends the message back. He's setting his own agenda here. Well, the word that's used for fox, the Greek word, is the word actually she-fox. And it was an epithet among the ancient Jews. This was the most worthless kind of beast you can imagine. It wasn't a word kind of highlighting cunning. We sometimes think of a fox, a fox being smart or cunning. That's not the sense of the word. It was just a nuisance animal. When Candy and I used to live out on the farm, we had these wonderful little animals. We call them moles. I am convinced that God created them after the fall. They have no legitimate reason to exist. They were the most awful, troubling little critters. They would crawl around under the ground and make a mess of your lawn, and it was just terrible, and you couldn't get rid of them. That's really the kind of the word that only it's even more insulting than that Jesus applies to Herod. So that was Jesus' assessment of Herod, just a small man who lived in a kind of luxury he didn't deserve and was as two-dimensional as you can imagine when it came to really, exercising his duties as a ruler. And so that's the kind of, and you see the superficiality. He's so excited to see Jesus because he wants to see a magic trick. He's heard Jesus does magic and he wants to see some entertainment here. I'm no fan of the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, but they do this scene pretty well. And in that scene, when Jesus shows up before Herod, one of the lines from Herod is this. It goes like this: "Show us that you are no fool. Walk across my swimming pool," And that's the spirit. I think that was pretty close to it. No real interest in Jesus. He just wanted to be entertained, and that's the superficiality of this encounter that Jesus has then with Herod. And so he asks him all kinds of big convoluted questions with many words, and Jesus answered nothing. Then the high priest, scribes step forward and accuse him. And then it says, Herod and his soldiers, and the Greek word here, there's no way to translate it. Herod and his soldiers nothinged him. It used to be translated, set him at naught. But it means just treated him as if he were nothing, and mocked him and put this sensational robe on him. I imagine something like, Liberace used to wear, that kind of thing, just over the top. And of course the whole thing was just to make fun, just to make a complete mockery of this one who had been brought before him. And then Herod sends him back to Pilate, in a sense, in disdain. And now Jesus comes back in this ridiculous get-up, just this complete dismissive setting him at naught is really the idea. Pilate and Herod become friends at the expense of Jesus, I think is the sense Luke wants us to get. There is a friendship this world can have, a camaraderie this world can have in its hostility to things that are truly virtuous. There is a peace that we can have in the virtue of Christ, and there's a peace we can have, in a sense, over against the virtue and the righteousness of Christ. I think that's what Luke is saying here, although some commentators take a different view. All right, I think we can just squeeze in our last paragraph. So let's go ahead of it. Pilate called together the high priests and the rulers of the people and said to them, "You haul this man before me as a disruptor of the people, And behold, look, I have questioned him before you, and I have found nothing worthy of these accusations. I sent him to Herod, and he sent him back, impliedly with the same conclusion. There is nothing worthy of death that he has done. So look, I will scourge him and release him. And they cried out immediately, saying, Away with this man, release rather to us Barabbas, who was convicted for sedition in the city and murder, and for that reason thrown into prison. Again Pilate cried out to them that he wished to release to them Jesus. But they called back, saying, Crucify, crucify him. The third time he said to them, What evil has he done? I find nothing worthy of death in him. I will scourge him and release him. And they were insistent in loud voices, demanding that he be crucified, and their voices prevailed. And Pilate wrote the sentence, and he released to them the one who, because of sedition and murder, had been thrown into prison, but Jesus he delivered over to their will. So this is the final, then, trial. In a sense, now, the trial conducted by Pilate is already over, and now Pilate is buckling beneath the will of the people. We have not just the Sanhedrin, but the impression is now the entire crowd that has gathered as this thing has taken place are now taking their stand against him. Just a few thoughts in this paragraph. Pilate gathered them together. He said, you brought this guy before me as some kind of a bad guy. I've questioned him. I found nothing worthy of these accusations. Herod didn't either. So look, I'm going to scourge him and let him go. Now that was no small thing. I think you know that a Roman scourging was a ghastly form of torture. I'm not going to go into the details. I think you're familiar with it, but they kind of ripped the flesh right off a person's back and body and so on. So certainly Jesus didn't deserve that, let alone crucifixion. But Pilate's trying to throw them a bone here and trying to appease them on that basis. But of course, they cry out, Away with this man, deliver to us rather Barabbas. And then Luke tells us who Barabbas is or was. He was a man who had been caught in sedition in the city and for murder had been thrown into prison. Now the interesting thing about Barabbas, and we find this in other gospel accounts, Luke doesn't mention it, but we otherwise know that his full name was Jesus Barabbas. The Greek word Jesus is from the Hebrew word Yeshua, which we otherwise know of as Joshua. So the name itself was very common. It'd be like the name John or something, just a common name. Jesus didn't have a unique name in that sense. So here's Barabbas. The name itself, Jesus, Bar, means son of, and Abba means father. So the full name of Barabbas was Jesus, son of the Father. Let's see. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because now we realize there's two guys whose sort of judicial status is at stake. One Jesus, the son of the Father, and another Jesus, the son of the Father. And isn't it interesting that they are trying to pin Jesus here in this trial with crimes that had actually been committed by the other guy? They're trying to say Jesus Jesus of Nazareth is an insurrectionist. He's a guy who's trying to incite the people to riot. He's a guy that's trying to throw off the power of Rome. He's trying to do all these things that the other Jesus had actually done and had been convicted of. And I think Luke sets this up to dramatize the idea of substitution. You've got two men, one of whom richly deserved the judgment that should have befallen him, Jesus Barabbas. Another who deserved none of it. And yet in this remarkable, sort of unexpected interplay of events, the one that deserved the punishment is set free. And the one who didn't deserve it takes everything the first one deserved and more. So they demand that this other Barabbas be released from them. The high priest, the scribes, verse 19 then. And they were, verse 20, we just did 19, sorry. And again, Pilate asked them, said to them, or yelled to them actually, this appears to be happening across a distance, yelled to them, that he wished to release Jesus. And they yelled back. You get the feeling this is over about maybe 50 yards of distance or something. Crucify him. The third time he said to them, what has he done? Notice how Pilate keeps wanting to focus on what has he done. These people keep accusing him of who he is. Pilate wants to sink his teeth into something for which he can actually blame him, And that's what is conspicuous for its absence in the entire proceeding. And so he says, I find nothing worthy of death in him. I will scourge him and let him go. But they raise their voices insistently, and their voices prevailed. And that, of course, is the critical point. Their voices prevailed. Luke is trying to paint Pilate here in at least somewhat favorable terms. He's not viewed as just wicked to the core, but he's certainly spineless. That's kind of the way it comes across. He bows to the will of the mob. In political theory, there are two great evils: totalitarianism and mob rule. They're both to be avoided. The more I've studied the Founding Fathers, I teach them every year in teaching civics. We go back and read Federalist Papers, and every year I'm more impressed with these guys, that they were trying so carefully to keep that balance, to give voice to the popular sentiment and yet always keep a limit on it, lest it devolve into mob rules, because there's two ugly things. There's when a totalitarian government imposes its will across the people without any ability on their parts to respond, and the other great evil is when the mob can force the government to do its will, and there's no check there, and that's really the idea here. Their voices prevailed. And notice how Luke puts this. He released the one who on account of sedition and murder had been cast into prison. But Jesus he delivered over to their will. And that is the end of the trials of Jesus. Next week we'll see the crucifixion, burial, and then the week after that, get to the last chapter. Well, thank you all so much. We will press on next week. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we are deeply grateful that as sobering as these events are, and as much as we really feel the anguish that is associated with this story of the trial and the death of Christ, we are at the same time so deeply grateful that it was because you so loved us that you sent your Son into the world, and that we can, by vesting our faith in Him, have that great, deep, eternal comfort that comes through your grace. We thank you that Jesus did this for us, and we pray that our review of these things would cause us to even more deeply and fervently appreciate and love and worship you, the one who gave this great gift. Give you thanks for it now in the name of Christ. Amen.